Hey, Dr. Jessica McLeese here, licensed clinical psychologist and certified sex therapist. And I want to teach you today about a few myths that people sometimes believe about sex and marriage. And specifically, these are myths that my Facebook group let me know about. So they're ones that I want to address and make sure that you get to hear them as well. And before I do, I want to tell you which myths I'm addressing today so you can decide if you want to listen to this entire video. So I'm going to talk about the myth that women need emotional connection in the sexual relationship and that men need physical. I'm also going to talk about getting too creative in your marriage bed and how that could be a problem. Okay, going to talk about that myth. And then finally, I'm going to talk about the myth that it hurts the first time that you have sex. Okay, now that you know if you want to stay tuned and listen to these myths, I'm going to jump on in with that first one, that women need an emotional connection and men need a physical connection during sex. Now, this is something that's been taught for a very long time, not just in Christian circles, but I feel like it probably happens more in Christian circles than outside of that, where there's this emphasis that women really desire emotional connection and that that's kind of the big fulfillment of sex for them. In fact, I myself have kind of gotten into a place of speaking about that at times based on research that I was trying to share about how oxytocin increases for the woman during foreplay and during times where she's more connected to her lover, and it increases more for men at the point of orgasm. And so I myself have sometimes taught it in a way where it sounds like that's what I'm saying, that women want the emotional and men want the physical. Now, here's the reality. As we've learned more about sex and as we've learned more about people in general, more and more sex therapists are starting to teach something a little bit different, that both men and women want both. In fact, Dr. Barry McCarthy, who has been a sex therapist for many decades, has recently taught new information saying that when we look at male sexuality, we start to realize that sometimes there's dysfunction there or problems there because the emotional side is being ignored. And when you have a couple, if you're ignoring either the emotional or either the physical, for the man or the woman, you're starting to kind of disconnect from what the sexual relationship should actually be. So you start to minimize the connection that they can actually have. You start to kind of shy away from this full body connection that a man and woman can have. Now, I have always taught that men and women both are physical, emotional, and spiritual, and I still believe that, and I absolutely teach couples how to have connection in all of those areas. But the big thing that I want to emphasize is when women are not wanting to engage their partners sexually, it may not be just because there's a lack of emotional connection. It may be that they're really wanting a physical connection that hasn't been there. They're wanting maybe more excitement or more arousal or more enjoyment of that experience. And the same is true for men. Typically, we think that there's something going on physically if they don't want that sexual connection, but it could be that there's a piece of the emotional connection that is somehow missing that they're needing more of. So again, it is a myth that men only want the physical enjoyment from sex or they only want the physical connection. And it's a myth that women only want the emotional. Now, this doesn't mean that if in your marriage you've actually experienced it according to this myth. So men, if you're listening and you think, no, really, I just want the physical, I don't care about the emotional, I would ask you this. If your wife tells you she's not interested, do you just feel bad about that physically? Or do you feel a little bit rejected? Because if you're feeling this picture of rejection, if your wife is not interested, I can assure you that is part of the emotional side of you, and it indicates that you do indeed want an emotional connection with your wife as well. And women, I would ask you the same. If you're thinking, sex doesn't do much for me, I don't enjoy it, I just want it to get over with, then I would say that you're actually missing part of that physical connection where it can be fun for you. And you may also be missing part of the emotional if you're saying, I'm completely disconnected from my spouse and I'm only doing it for him. So big point here that I want to remind you is that sex is not just for a man on a physical level only, and sex isn't just for a woman on an emotional level only. You're both pieces, physical and emotional, as well as spiritual. And so all of those pieces come together in the sexual relationship, and all of them are important. Whether you're male or whether you're female doesn't discount that truth. All of those things are important. Okay, second myth that I told you we would talk about is that you got to be careful with creativity in your marriage bed because it's a slippery slope and you don't know how far you might go. Now, this is something that has at least occurred for some people because it was told to me in my Facebook group when I asked about the myths that's one of the things that they've heard, that you got to be really careful. My last video talked about sexual positions and how missionary was the only one. That's a myth too, in case you didn't see that video. But the idea behind this was that we got to be really careful because we don't want to go down that slippery slope. We don't want to do things that end up getting us into this sinful behavior. Really, that comes from this belief that the body is somehow bad, or that physical interaction is bad. And I would remind you, first of all, that that doesn't actually line up with a theology of sex. If you believe that creativity is a problem, or that having the physical attraction, or that the body is somehow dirty or negative or not good, you're actually engaged in really some dualistic thinking. And so we call the spirit good, but the body bad. And that's not really the way that our scripture lines up. So if you're familiar with, say, theology of the body, then you're going to understand that we have to believe, and we have to state as Christians that the body is good. Not only are our bodies created by God, who can only create good, but we also know that God himself came into the flesh. He became flesh for us so that he could walk amongst us. He took on flesh, and so flesh cannot be bad. Body has to be good because God himself decided that that's how he was going to walk amongst us. That's how he was going to show himself to us. And so if God himself can become flesh, and we call him Jesus, then we have to know that the flesh is good. And so we have this picture of the incarnate God, and that's how we can say, hey, the body is good because this is how God chose to live with us. I am getting a little repetitive here, so I'm going to move on beyond that. But I do want to say that creativity is totally welcome in your marriage. It's okay. It's not really a slippery slope as long as you're following those boundaries that God has laid out. So if you're doing something that you know that God has said is wrong, then it's wrong no matter what. So for instance, I've had couples sometimes ask me, well, what if we both want to engage in affairs and we want to have an open marriage? Would that be okay since we both want it? And I would still say scripture would tell us no. So part of what you learn in marriage is what it looks like to have a relationship with Christ. And so when we're learning to be devoted only to the one, spiritually speaking, we're also at the same time learning what it means to have only devotion to God, no other gods before him. So take that message into heart and realize that the body is good, creativity is fine and good. Read Song of Songs as a couple and just enjoy the creativity that you can have in your marriage, and know that it is a myth to think that creativity will lead you down some slippery slope where you're going to lose your salvation. All right, myth number 3 is that it can hurt the first time. So there are lots of virgin couples that get together and get married, and specifically women are taught very frequently that it hurts really bad the first time. So just kind of suck it up, make it happen, get through the process. It's going to be okay once you're all done. And so when women believe that, it actually causes some anxiety and it causes more pain than what they would have had otherwise. And so it's really important for women to understand that the first time doesn't have to hurt. And if it hurt really bad, then you should probably go ahead and see a doctor and find out what was going on there. And if it continues to hurt, that's a sign of either a physical issue or concern, or it's a sign that emotionally there's so much anxiety there that you're having a hard time connecting. And that can come from negative thinking too. So if you have a theology that says that virginity is best and it's prized, and then you're having a hard time actually enjoying your sexual relationship because those messages are still playing in your head, then that can cause that anxious response as well. So a couple of things you can do if you're having pain. First of all, get checked out by a gynecologist and maybe see a pelvic pain specialist as well. So a pelvic pain specialist can work with you and see if there's any kind of indication that something might be wrong there. And then if those things aren't working, see a sex therapist, because that's going to be one of the most helpful things you can do if there is pain in your body. You don't have to continue to live that way. Please, please, please see somebody if you need some help. So those were those 3 myths again, just so I can read them to you one more time and you can remember that they're myths. The first myth was that women need the emotional relationship and men need the physical. It's a myth because both of us need both. And then secondly, be careful with creativity because you could go too far. That's a myth. We serve a creative God. Creativity is fine and acceptable as long as you're within the boundaries of Scripture, and those are nice and large for you. And then finally, it hurts the first time. Not necessarily true. So if you're experiencing pain in your sexual relationship, get some help for that. There is much help that can be found. In fact, if that one happens to be your concern, I have a blog on my website, befullywell.com, and the specific blog is called What to Do When Sex Hurts. So check that out if you're needing a little bit more help. And for the rest of you, I would love to start bringing you some special content that's just for you. And so I do that on my email list. I send my subscribers specific information just for them and information that they get ahead of time before anybody else. Hey, I'd love for you to hit the subscribe button on this video. Every time I get an email saying somebody is subscribed, it gives me a little dopamine burst. And it lets me know that you actually like this information and I should continue to bring this type of information. All right, God bless you, your marriage, and your intimacy.